Hey, before we get started, I want to remind you that Truce is listener-supported. If you want to be a part of this one-of-a-kind show that asks big questions in an approachable way, become a patron. For just $5 a month, you can help me tell big stories like this upcoming season on the history of fundamentalism. And you'll get access to bonus materials. That's all at patreon.com/trucepodcast. That's patreon.com/trucepodcast.
This episode is brought to you by Our Daily Bread Ministries, a global media organization that makes the life-changing wisdom of the Bible understandable and accessible to all. Visit whereyou'refrom.org for more information. That's whereyafrom.org.
This episode is part of a long series exploring how some Christians in the United States tied themselves to the Republican Party. It can stand on its own, but when you're done, go back to the beginning of Season 6 for more context. Also, in a few minutes, I'll be discussing a book that contains violence towards women. It won't be graphic, but it may not be appropriate for the little ones. We will also mention public school education about reproduction. Hint, hint. Okay, here goes. What could be more boring than a school board meeting? On April 11th, 1974, the school board assembled in Kanawha County, West Virginia. That day, their goal was to approve a slate of new textbooks and supplementary materials for the 125 public schools in the county. 4 members of the board were men. 1 was a woman. That was Alice Moore. She ran for a seat on the school board after, according to her, she discovered that her district's comprehensive sexual education course wasn't just about sex ed. It discussed how to think, feel, and act, and questioned kids about their relationship with their parents. Despite her complaints, the superintendent didn't make any changes. So, she ran for the job and won. Here she was, at a hearing about books. A group of experts had been established with the goal of bringing in more diverse ideas and opinions. Alice looked over their recommendation, and something stood out. A call for dialectology, encouraging kids to speak naturally and in their own dialect in the classroom. Alice found this objectionable, saying she would not tolerate dem and dat being used in place of them and that. Kanawha had a combination of towns and rural areas, places where people may not speak proper English. In her mind, dialectology was another way to bring liberalism into the schools. Still, when the vote came around, she agreed to approve the books. The timeline is a bit fuzzy, but according to Moore, at that meeting, her husband approached her to show her what kind of books she just approved. One, the Autobiography of Malcolm X, contained this phrase:
"All praise is due to Allah that I moved to Boston when I did. If I hadn't, I'd be a brainwashed black Christian."
Moore was shocked. What had she just approved? That short quote packs a real punch. First, it praises a God different than the one worshipped by the religious people of the area. It also referred to black Christians as brainwashed. It both denigrated Christianity and African Americans who believe in Jesus. Alice objected, saying she wanted all the approved texts delivered to her house, something like 300 books. What followed went far beyond a disagreement. Within months, the county was in an uproar. People boycotted the schools, snipers fired on school buses, and buildings were dynamited. This battle over words on paper touched something deep in the American psyche, something that had been building for years, posing big questions. When, if ever, should students be exposed to objectionable material like discussing rape, murder, moral relativism, or differing opinions about religion or the founding of the United States? This was Kanawha County, and it was about to go to war. You're listening to the show that uses journalistic tools to look inside the Christian church. We press pause on the culture wars in order to explore how we got here and how we can do better. I'm Chris Staron, and this is Truce. This season, we're taking a look at how some evangelical Christians in the United States tied themselves to the Republican Party. One thing I've noticed over the last year or so reading about this topic is that people tend to look for a silver bullet, that one moment or topic that catalyzed Christians around the Republicans. It's about race or backlash against feminism and gay rights, reliance on conspiracy theories, societal tumult, fear of the end times, tax breaks, who gets to educate our children, or economics. The only problem is there isn't one easy answer. In truth, each of those things contributed, often at the exact same time. Each of them warrants exploration. So for the next several episodes, we're going to pull apart these different forces, because they're all important. You'll notice that it will be hard for me to go in chronological order because many of these movements happened at the same time, the 1970s. So we're going to go through them topically and then tie it all together. Okay, so let's begin with a little brain exercise. What is the purpose of public schools? I mean, it seems easy, right? To teach kids how to read, write, learn history, and do math. But what are the greater goals we have as a society? Well, one idea is that an educated populace creates jobs and allows us to compete with other nations. As I've covered earlier this season, that's why we invested so heavily in colleges, universities, and community colleges in the 1950s and 60s, to beat the communists. But there are other advantages, right? In a democratic republic like the United States, we want our citizens to have a basic understanding of how their government functions, what we are as a country, and those kids are going to grow up and someday, hopefully, vote. Others would argue that public school prepares young people for adulthood. It lifts poor people out of poverty, thereby decreasing the number of people seeking governmental aid. It also teaches us to be citizens of this nation, maybe even to learn our founding myths, which builds patriotism. And that patriotism leads some to serve their country in the military or by holding public office. There are all kinds of reasons why we do what we do. And if you think of more, find the show on social media and let's discuss. Public schools in the U.S. were advocated for by the early Puritans. Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and George Washington all called for them. But by the 1840s, there were only a handful open, and only in communities that could afford them. That doesn't exactly work with the American ethos of equality, where anyone from any background can rise to do great things. Advocates pushed for decades to establish free schooling to every child, but it wasn't until 1918 that schooling was mandated for all children through elementary grades, though, of course, they were still allowed to be segregated. Kids in the U.S. have only been required to get an education for just over 100 years. I think the timing is integral. It was right in the end of that progressive era in the United States where women would earn the right to vote. Prohibition was in the air, the pure food movement, and labor laws. The country in the 19-teens was caught up in this desire to make the world better through legislation. But as we covered last season, there were other forces at work as well. Premillennialism and dispensationalism took off, telling certain Christians that history trends towards destruction, but so does the church. Instead of we can make the world better through good laws, this interpretation of the Bible predicts some pretty heinous persecution for Christians. Their interpretation of Revelation 13 predicts that an evil being is going to rule over a one-world government in the end times. That person will persecute Christians.
Revelation 13:7. It was also given to him to make war with the saints and to overcome them, and authority was given to him over every tribe, people, language, and nation.
That may seem tangential, but remember that premillennialist dispensationalists at this time are on the lookout for a one-world government, which makes some of them distrustful of government in general. It might be worth noting once more that this does not go for all Christians, not even all evangelicals. But it was spreading. 2 years after that law passed where all kids had to attend school, the League of Nations was created, the precursor to the United Nations. You know, a united body bringing together lots of world powers. To some Christians, not all, this looked like a one-world government. And the American government on its own was expecting more and more from its people now that it required them to educate their children. The government was entering the household and impacting children. It wasn't until the Supreme Court case Brown v. Board of Education of 1954 that all public schools were supposed to be integrated, though this turned out to be difficult to enforce, especially in racist areas. Then in 1962, the U.S. Supreme Court made it illegal to offer a prescribed prayer in public schools. We covered this last episode. And 1 year later, it did the same for Bible reading. Among some evangelical Christians, including Alice Moore, it seemed that the United States was trying to push God out of the public square. This happened just 2 decades after God was added to the money, our Pledge of Allegiance, the founding of the National Day of Prayer, the National Prayer Breakfast, and the erection of monuments to the Ten Commandments. It seemed to some like public Christianity was on the outs. Mix that with the tumult of 1974, when the school board reconvened to hear objections to the books chosen in Kanawha County. It was during the Watergate scandal, 2 months before Nixon's resignation, the aftermath of an oil crisis, the troubles in Ireland, airline hijackings, and rising crime. That's important to understand what's about to happen at this school board meeting. Sometimes all these changes and these pressures build up, waiting for a moment of catharsis. The school board reconvened on June 27, 1974, during a heavy downpour. About 2,000 people tried to squeeze into the building, but many stood outside in the rain. 2,000 people at a school board meeting. A preacher friendly to Alice Moore spoke against a book that had been chosen for high school seniors, Soul on Ice by Black Panther Eldridge Cleaver. By the way, as mentioned at the beginning, this section discusses the topic of rape. I want to read a section of the text for you, because out of context it will seem like Alice Moore and her supporters are racist hicks wound up too tightly. By getting a little taste of this, it may deepen your understanding of what they were working with. Okay, so early in the book, Cleaver writes about Voltaire and learning to hate capitalism thanks to the writings of Karl Marx. Already a red flag for conservative people engaged in the Cold War. 1 page later, he writes about his past of sexual violence. Somehow I arrived at the conclusion that, as a matter of principle, it was of paramount importance for me to have an antagonistic, ruthless attitude towards white women. He continued a few lines later. To refine my techniques and modus operandi, I started out by practicing on black girls in the ghetto. In the black ghetto, where dark and vicious deeds appear not as aberrations or deviations from the norm, but as part of the sufficiency of the evil of a day. And when I considered myself smooth enough, I crossed the tracks and sought out white prey. And a little further down, rape was an insurrectionary act. It delighted me that I was defying and trampling upon the white man's law, upon his system of values, and that I was defiling his women. Okay, how do we feel about this? To be clear, Cleaver goes on to repent for what he did. It's a meditation on unchecked hatred, for which he seeks forgiveness. But do you want your high school senior reading about a man purposely going out and raping women because of their race, saying that it's easier to rape black women? Now, this depends on the stuff we talked about earlier. What is your idea of the purpose of public education? Let's look at it from a more liberal point of view. For a lot of Americans, high school is the last formal education they get. Where else can they have a frank conversation about race, anger, violence, and redemption? Or how a person can be so angry at an oppressor that they want to lash out and do something terrible. But also, you can see how parents, conservative or liberal, might want to limit the degree to which their kids learn about violence and this kind of animosity towards another race. Alice Moore objected because she thought this was not a fair representation of the black experience. A public radio documentary on this battle included an interview with a local pastor named Ron English, who agreed that some black people in the area at the time saw this language as anti-Christian and anti-American. Another pastor in Kanawha County denounced Soul on Ice. While he did that, Alice Moore kind of cross-examined him. What about a textbook that featured the story of Androcles and the lion? This, as you may remember, is the story of a slave who runs away into the woods, where he encounters a lion. But the lion doesn't chase him, because the beast has a thorn in its paw. Androcles takes out the thorn and the two part ways. The slave gets caught and is sentenced to being thrown to the lions. But guess what? The lion he encounters is the one he saved, and all is well. It doesn't hurt him, and the slave is set free. It's one of Aesop's fables. How could anyone object to Aesop? Well, one textbook urged students to compare and contrast that story with Daniel in the lion's den from the Bible. The pastor's objection? Comparing the myth of Aesop with Scripture makes Scripture look like it didn't happen. Like it too is just a moral fable. Maybe you can kind of see that, right? Remember, daily Bible readings and school prayer had been outlawed in schools fairly recently. So it made it much harder to make the case for the Bible because of the law. But one could still offer a critique of the text or present the Bible as a myth. Alice Moore said that liberal school bureaucrats intended to attack religious conviction
by compelling their children by law to be in that classroom, and then undermining everything they believed in.
She also cited a text that described Freud's Oedipus complex, where young girls are sexually attracted to their fathers and boys to their mothers. Alice knew she was going to be accused of being narrow-minded because of her religion, and seemed to resent that, as well as the content of these books that encourage students to explore moral relativism, or the idea that one person can have a different moral compass or truth from everyone else. A parent named Mike Winger defended the books, arguing,
"To summarize, this is the only world in which we live. We cannot hide it from our children. We can only determine when they will find it and where they will find it. Let them find it today rather than tomorrow, and let them find it here in our schools rather than on some street corner in New York or some rice paddy in Vietnam."
The points were put forth. The crowd packed in. Once again, the board voted. And this time, Moore was the only person who did not vote in favor of the adoption of the books. Her motions failed. As she stepped out of the room and into the downpour, she was greeted by her supporters as a sort of Christian hero. She stood up against moral relativism and gritty violence. What followed would be weeks of protest, danger, and violence as coal miners and national media joined the fray. Could the people of Kanawha County come to a peaceful decision? Or would the struggle over who gets to teach children explode even further? I'll continue the story after this short break. Hey everybody, as we head into the ads, maybe take a couple seconds and tell your friends and family that you enjoy the Truce podcast. This show is done on kind of a micro budget, and I rely heavily on folks like you to spread the word. So maybe take a second, send a text, post something on social media, and we'll be right back. This episode is brought to you by No Small Endeavor, the acclaimed podcast from Great Feeling Studios and PRX. In each episode, host and award-winning theologian Lee C. Camp sits down with courageous and impassioned people, like Hollywood legend Rob Reiner and civil rights hero Reverend James Lawson, talking about what it means to find true happiness and flourish in day-to-day life. And if you're looking for somewhere to start, why not check out the recent episode with award-winning journalist and best-selling author Tim Alberta on Christian nationalism's role in the Republican Party. Follow No Small Endeavor on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Alice Moore, or Sweet Alice as she was known locally, was not the only person pouncing on textbooks. She was in touch with two people well known in conservative circles for reviewing textbooks, Mel and Norma Gabler. Last season, we discussed an interesting phenomenon that took off in the 1800s in Christian circles, the rise of parachurch organizations. This is when an organization that is not a church comes alongside the church in order to serve an adjacent function. Now think about the youth movements we discussed earlier. They were driven in part by organizations like Youth for Christ or Campus Crusade. They are parachurch organizations. The same is true for things like Focus on the Family, Christianity Today, or really, this show. But it's important to note that anyone can start one and there is really no oversight, which is where parachurch organizations can get tricky. Because an organization that is wacky or behaving poorly can be seen as the church doing something when it may just be a few people in an office or someone's basement. Or in my case, literally recording in the VBS storage room in my church. These are all the plastic boxes and things behind me. Got it? That's parachurch organizations. Okay, so Mel and Norma Gabler had their own parachurch organization to study textbooks. They said they were helping Christians, but again, with no real accountability. According to the Gablers, they became interested in the subject when their son came home confused by what the founding fathers of the country stood for. This clip is from the show Firing Line.
Then he asked if he could bring his textbook home, and I said, of course. And before he handed it to me, he had his finger in a certain place, and he said, Dad, tell me what the framers of the Constitution had in mind when they wrote the Constitution. I told him.
Listen closely to what Mel told him, because it'll give you a pretty good idea of what he and Norma believed in.
I told him they wanted a limited government with power enough to keep the states together for common defense, but to leave the rights, the privileges, and the powers as much as possible up to the individuals, the local governments, and states. He said, not according to my book. My book's teaching me we have a dictatorship in Washington.
This incident, combined with one later where they discovered that an encyclopedia had left God out of the Gettysburg Address, encouraged the Gablers to get involved.
So then he asked us the question, Dad and Mom, if a young person's textbooks are slanted, and if his reference material is slanted, where can a young person go to find the truth? And this is what we've been trying to do ever since.
They formed educational resource analysts out of their home and raised money to champion their cause. The Gablers, as you may have inferred, had a decidedly specific view of government. They favored small government and decried any textbook that showed warmth to the United Nations or the New Deal. Remember, some conservatives were afraid of the New Deal because they considered it a stepping stone to socialism. They were uneasy about the UN for reasons we already discussed, thinking it was a nudge towards a one-world government. They were also dead set that the US be depicted as God's chosen nation. They also didn't like it when Confederate generals were disparaged in books, or the founding fathers were shown to be deists. By the way, you can hear a whole episode about the real and imagined faith of the founding fathers in Season 3. Famously, the Gablers had won a requirement in Texas that textbooks discuss evolution as one of many theories. Texas was vitally important to the textbook industry because it was the largest purchaser of textbooks and other states followed its lead. The Gablers had a big impact right from their home. When Alice Moore, the school board member we've been talking about in West Virginia, reached out, they told her that liberal secularists used morbid, negative, or depressing tones to communicate their ideas, citing Edgar Allan Poe's The Cask of Amontillado, in which a man murders another without showing remorse or facing consequences. They cited the Ten Commandments and the Bible as the ultimate judge of morality. Another book they didn't like was called Communicating. In it, students were asked to break into small groups and discuss Jack and the Beanstalk. Now you remember the story. Jack goes up the beanstalk and takes stuff from the giants in the sky. The discussion questions asked, is it okay for a person to steal? What difference is there between a rich man and a poor man stealing? That clashes pretty clearly with the Ten Commandments that say, thou shalt not steal. There really aren't qualifications there that say it's okay for some and not for others. The Gablers gathered their materials and headed for West Virginia. Alice Moore's battle was far from the only one. There were other notable disruptions in Boston, Virginia, and Connecticut. But misinformation started coming out, including a flyer that claimed to be a copy of a textbook demonstrating how men should put on a condom, complete with a graphic image. The picture was not from any approved textbook. It was a copy of an image from the public library, not one in schools. It was a forgery meant to stir trouble. A young preacher with a dimpled chin named Marvin Horan called for a boycott of the schools. Others wanted to burn books, which, by the way, is rarely a good look. Parents were faced with a serious question of whether or not to send their children to school. Was it even safe with this many hostile people in the region? On September 3rd, the first day of classes, about 20% of children stayed home. And the protest was on. Kanawha County was mining country, and they were used to going on strike. Women went to the mines to convince men to join the boycott. Solidarity was big there. If one group protested, they all did. Soon, people from the chemical plant and municipal bus drivers joined in. Parents in Dickinson blocked school buses from leaving the bus yard, so students didn't have access to transportation. Those who drove their children to school had to cross a picket line, avoid eye contact with their neighbors. Schools were closed for 3 days to conduct another review. The superintendent was quoted in the New York Times,
"Well, considering the fact that the county is bordering on lawlessness, I feel it is best to curtail all school activities for the weekend."
Things continued to spiral out of control as Reverend Ezra Grayley spoke to a crowd with demands that no school board could ever agree to, like reinstatement of coal miners who had been dismissed for wildcat picketing. The school board was not in charge of coal miners, but that was what he demanded. Bomb threats were telephoned in. Parents in a neighboring county joined in and blocked their school buses as well. On October 12th, a car exploded outside of a woman's home. She'd been jailed for blocking school buses. Thankfully, nobody was hurt. Reporters from as far away as London settled into the hollers of West Virginia. One was stomped almost to death, though his crew managed to get away from the angry mob. On November 13th, a state police car was fired upon by a sniper rifle while escorting a school bus full of children. 3 other police cars had already been shot. On October 6th, 2 preachers set up an illegal rally in front of the school board offices. In the proceedings, they were represented by the Heritage Foundation, a new right organization we'll cover more in depth later this season. Reverend Horan said,
"If we don't protect our children, we'll have to account for it on the day of judgment."
The next day, he was arrested with 20 militants who sabotaged school buses. 12 hours later, 2 elementary schools were firebombed. A first-grade classroom was destroyed by a dynamite explosion. Soon, the school board offices were dynamited as well. And an all-out fistfight broke out during the school board meeting. Another common theme we'll see this season is that certain groups of extremists love to show up and cause a stink, not the least of which was the KKK. Alice Moore had been adamant that this was not an issue of race, but others argued that it certainly was. The area had long been racist, though, according to one source, is no longer today to the same extent. Despite the money spent by the protesters to denounce racist groups, many black people felt that the whole purpose of the event was race. Having the KKK show up likely didn't help. A second group of opportunists was the John Birch Society. They're a somewhat secretive group that was started in 1958 by a candy manufacturer famous for making products like Junior Mints. They're known for their conspiracy theories, seeing communist plots in everything from the UN to adding fluoride to water. They want to add patriotic texts to schools and libraries and ban sex education. They and the Klan kind of operate in the background of several episodes this season, from this one about school books to a future pro-family rally. A man named Delbert Rose confessed to throwing the dynamite into the school. During his interrogation, he revealed a plot to hook a blasting cap to the gas tank of a car. They would then wire it to the brake pedal, the goal being that when the driver tapped the brakes, it would blow up the vehicle. Thankfully, the plot wasn't carried out. But 6 people were indicted, including Reverend Martin Horan, the guy who called for the school boycott. Horan had given the crowd what he considered to be a justification for their violent actions. Proverbs 3, which tells us there is a time for peace and a time for war. He was convicted and sent to prison for 3 years. The controversy subsided after his trial, but it took years for the intermittent protests to end. The school board eventually came to an agreement that parents could be involved in choosing which books were used in the schools. Today, Kanawha County is closely associated with this moment. If you search for it online, this story pops up. It's a long shadow to be under. The textbook war demonstrates the kind of madness that was in the air in the 1970s. The pent-up anger and frustration. Change was everywhere as people reeled from the effects of the 1960s, and folks of different backgrounds obtained more attention from society. It turns out that change is really hard for humans to deal with, especially those of us who have a fixed way of thinking about the world. It demonstrated the deep feelings, resentments, hurts, and fears of people who felt left behind in the public square. Again, 2 decades earlier, public expression of the Judeo-Christian worldview was everywhere. School prayer, Bible readings in the classroom, the National Prayer Breakfast was started. God was added to the money and to the Pledge of Allegiance. Of course, it's good to represent other cultures and ideas, but what about the old majoritarian ideas? What happens to them? Which, again, brings up an interesting question from the beginning of this episode. What is the function of public schools, and who gets to decide what is taught? It turns out that there really isn't a simple answer to that question, or who gets to teach kids about scary and complex ideas. For a lot of Americans, high school is the last formal education they get. Should it be a broad understanding of different cultures, or a strong grasp on tradition and what makes us what we are today? Or both? A sense of patriotism to honor the fallen soldiers who gave their life to this country? Or an understanding that the United States, like so many countries, has an ugly history of racism and oppression? Or of course, what if we taught both? Should children leave the classroom with an understanding of morals, respect for others, and of right and wrong? Or should we account for past injustices and social norms? I started out by saying there is nothing more boring than a school board meeting. But is that the case? The truth is that education is tricky. Doing anything in public society is tricky. At this point in our story, the forces of evangelical Christianity were still dispersed, driven in large part by disconnected parachurch organizations, each with their own goals. Soon, those special interests would coalesce, not around a bunch of fragmented goals, but into something resembling a party platform. Certain types of education, fighting feminism, love of the traditional family, and conservative visions of economics. But it's important to remember that these things happened to real people, and those real people had to suss it out in the moment. When we ourselves are confronted with change, what will we do? Or when we're confronted with tradition, are we willing to make room for that? Hopefully, we can agree together that the textbook war was the wrong way to go. Conspiratorial preaching, threatening children who just wanted to go to class? How will we react to changing times? Or to tradition? Will it be with grace and dignity? Or violence and dynamite? I used a lot of different sources for this story today. You can find a complete list on the website at trucepodcast.com. While you're there, consider giving a little bit each month to help me make this show. It takes so many hours to produce, and I also have a full-time job as a school bus driver. I'd love to do this show full-time, and you can bring me one step closer to doing just that. Help via Patreon, PayPal, Venmo, or check. Really, however you can. trucepodcast.com/donate. Also, be good to your school bus drivers. If you want to know more about this battle in West Virginia, I recommend The Great Textbook War, an audio story from Us and Them that won a Peabody Award. It is excellent, and you can hear the voices of the people who were involved, including Alice Moore. I'll have links in your show notes and on the website. Thanks to everyone who loaned their voices to me for this episode, including my friends Chris Sloan and Marcus Watson of the Spiritual Life and Leadership Podcast, and Jackie Hart. I have 5 other seasons worth of episodes for you to enjoy, so feel free to go through the archives. Like and subscribe to the show and follow me on social media so you get every new episode as it's released. Thanks as always to my twin brother Nick for helping out with the show. Truce is a production of Truce Media, LLC. God willing, we'll talk again soon. I'm Chris Starin, and this is Truce.